The crack of thunder split the summer sky over Red Bluff, California, and Sarah Matthews dropped the basket of apples she had been carrying, her hands flying to cover her ears as she sank to her knees right there in the dusty street in front of the general store. It was July 1878, and the afternoon had turned dark with storm clouds that rolled in from the Sacramento Valley like an invading army. And nobody noticed the young woman trembling on the ground, except for the cowboy who had just tied his horse to the hitching post outside the saloon across the street. Ryder Quinn had been riding fence lines for the Patterson Ranch for 3 years now, and in all that time, he had seen plenty of things that surprised him. But watching a woman collapse at the sound of thunder struck something deep in his chest. He left his horse where it stood and crossed the street in long strides, his boots kicking up dust that the coming rain would soon turn to mud. By the time he reached her, another crack of thunder rolled across the sky, and he watched her whole body flinch like she had been struck. "Madam," he said, dropping to one knee beside her and placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Are you hurt?" Sarah could not answer. Her throat had closed up the way it always did when the storms came, and all she could do was shake her head while her eyes squeezed shut, and her breathing came in short, panicked gasps. The apples from her basket had rolled everywhere, some into the street, some onto the wooden walkway, and she knew she should gather them up, but she could not make her hands stop shaking long enough to do anything useful. Ryder looked up at the darkening sky and made a quick decision. "I am going to help you up now," he said, his voice low and steady. "There is a covered porch right here at the store. Can you stand?" She nodded, still not opening her eyes, and he slipped his arm around her waist and lifted her to her feet with an ease that spoke of years of hard physical work. He guided her the few steps to the covered porch and settled her onto the bench that sat against the storefront window. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, pattering on the roof above them, and he felt her whole body go rigid beside him. "It is just rain," he said softly, keeping his arm around her shoulders because she seemed like she might bolt or collapse again if he let go. "The storm cannot hurt you here. You do not understand," she managed to whisper, her voice so quiet he had to lean closer to hear her. "It is not the rain." Another boom of thunder answered her words, closer this time, and she turned her face into his chest without thinking, her hands clutching at his shirt. Ryder felt his heart kick against his ribs, not from fear of the storm, but from the way this woman seemed to fit against him like she belonged there. He had never been one for fancy thoughts or romantic notions, but something about holding her felt more right than anything had in a very long time. "I know it is the thunder," he said, his lips close to her ear so she could hear him over the rising wind. "I can hear that it scares you, but I am right here, and I will not let anything happen to you." Sarah knew she was being foolish. She was 22 years old, not a child, and she had been terrified of thunderstorms for as long as she could remember. Most people in Red Bluff knew about her fear by now, since she had lived here for 6 months, but they had learned to ignore it the way they ignored most things that made them uncomfortable. This cowboy, though, this stranger with the strong arms and the kind voice, he was not ignoring her at all. The storm unleashed its full fury then, rain hammering down in sheets that turned the street into a river within minutes. Lightning flashed bright enough to see even through her closed eyelids, and the thunder that followed shook the whole building. She heard herself make a sound that was half sob, half whimper, and she felt the cowboy's arms tighten around her. "Listen to my voice," Ryder said, his mouth right against her ear now. "I am going to talk, and you are going to listen to me instead of the storm. Can you do that?" She nodded against his chest, and he felt the dampness of tears soaking through his shirt. "My name is Ryder Quinn," he began, his voice steady and calm despite the chaos of the storm around them. "I work at the Patterson Ranch about 5 miles north of town. I have been there 3 years come September. Before that, I worked on a cattle drive from Texas up through Kansas, and before that I grew up on a farm in Missouri that my father lost after the war." Sarah focused on his words, on the deep rumble of his voice in his chest beneath her ear. He smelled like horses and leather, and something else she could not name, something warm and masculine that made her feel safer than she had any right to feel with a complete stranger. "I have 2 brothers and a sister," Ryder continued, still holding her close while the storm raged. "All of them stayed back east. I was the only one who wanted to come west and see what was out here. Turns out what is out here is a lot of hard work and dust and cattle, but I like it better than farming ever was." The thunder boomed again, but this time Sarah did not flinch quite as hard. She kept her eyes closed and her face pressed against his chest and let his words wash over her like a different kind of rain, one that soothed instead of frightened. "I am good with horses," he said. "Better than I am with people if I am being honest. Horses make sense to me. You treat them right, they treat you right. People are more complicated." He paused and she felt him take a breath. "Though right now, holding you like this, you do not seem complicated at all. You seem like someone who needs help and I am someone who can give it. That is about as simple as things get." Sarah finally opened her eyes and tilted her head back to look at him. His face was all hard angles and weathered skin, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun. His eyes were a pale blue-gray, like the sky right before a storm, and they looked down at her with such genuine concern that she felt something crack open in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "I am Sarah Matthews." "Pleased to meet you, Miss Matthews," he said, and the corner of his mouth quirked up in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Though I wish it had been under better circumstances." The storm continued for another 20 minutes, and Ryder held her through all of it, talking whenever the thunder got loud and falling silent during the quieter moments when just the rain drummed on the roof above them. He told her about the first time he had ridden a horse by himself and how he had fallen off and broken his arm. He told her about his mother's apple pie and how he had never tasted anything as good since she died. He told her about the time he and his brothers had tried to build a raft to float down the creek near their farm, and how it had fallen apart halfway across and left them all soaking wet and laughing so hard they could barely breathe. By the time the thunder began to move off into the distance, Sarah had stopped shaking. She felt wrung out and exhausted, the way she always did after a storm, but she also felt something else. She felt seen. This cowboy had not looked at her like she was crazy or weak or childish. He had simply held her and talked to her and made her feel like her fear was something he could help her carry, at least for a little while. When the rain finally slowed to a drizzle, Ryder eased back a little, though he did not let go of her completely. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Better," she said, and it was true. "I am sorry for falling apart on you like that. You must think I am ridiculous." "I do not think that at all," he said firmly. "Everyone is afraid of something. You are afraid of thunder. I know men who are afraid of heights or water or being closed in. Fear is just fear. It does not make you less than anyone else." Sarah looked down at her hands, which were finally steady again. "Most people do not see it that way. They think I should just get over it." "Most people are fools," Ryder said bluntly, and that startled a laugh out of her. She looked up at him again and saw that he was serious, not teasing. "You really mean that?" "I really do." He finally let go of her and stood up, then offered her his hand. "Let me help you gather up your apples. Some of them probably rolled too far to save, but we can rescue what we can." They spent the next few minutes collecting the apples that had scattered when she dropped the basket. The street was still muddy and wet, but the sun was already beginning to break through the clouds, turning everything golden and fresh washed. Sarah found herself sneaking glances at Ryder as they worked, noticing things she had been too frightened to see before. He moved with an easy grace despite his size, and his hands were gentle when he placed the apples back in her basket, careful not to bruise them. "Where were you taking these?" he asked when they had gathered all they could find. "To the boarding house where I live," she said. "Mrs. Chen, who runs it, asked me to pick some up from the store so she could make pies for tomorrow's meals." "I will walk you there," Ryder said, picking up the basket before she could protest. "It is the least I can do after you let me practice my talking skills." Sarah smiled at that, a real smile that felt strange on her face after all the crying. "I think your talking skills are just fine." They walked together through the muddy streets of Red Bluff, past the saloon and the feed store and the little church that sat on the corner of Main Street and Oak. The town was not large, maybe 300 people on a good day, but it had grown considerably since the railroad had come through 2 years before. Sarah had come here from San Francisco after her parents died in a fire, looking for somewhere quieter and simpler to start over, and she had found work as a seamstress working out of her room at Mrs. Chen's boarding house. "How long have you been afraid of storms?" Ryder asked as they walked. Sarah hesitated, then decided that since he had already seen her at her absolute worst, there was no point in hiding anything now. "Since I was 7 years old. My older brother and I were playing in a barn during a thunderstorm, even though we knew we were not supposed to. Lightning struck the barn. He died and I lived, and ever since then the sound of thunder makes me feel like I am back in that barn watching him die." Ryder stopped walking and turned to look at her, his expression somber. "I am sorry. That is a terrible thing for anyone to carry, especially a child." "My parents never blamed me out loud," Sarah said quietly. "But I always knew they thought it was my fault. I was the older one by 2 years. I should have known better. I should have kept him safe." "You were 7, Ryder said. 7-year-olds do not have the sense to know better, and they surely do not have the power to control lightning." He shifted the basket to his other hand and started walking again. "I reckon you have been carrying that guilt for 15 years now. That is a long time to punish yourself for something that was not your fault." Sarah blinked back fresh tears, surprised by how much his words affected her. She had never told anyone in Red Bluff about her brother, had never explained why the storms terrified her so much. Most people did not ask, and she did not volunteer the information. But something about Ryder made her want to be honest, to strip away all the layers of pretense she usually wore and just be herself. They reached Mrs. Chen's boarding house, a tidy 2-story building with a wide front porch and window boxes full of flowers. Ryder carried the basket up the steps and set it down by the front door, then turned to face her. "I am glad I was there today," he said. "I know it probably did not feel like much to you, just some stranger talking your ear off during a storm, but I am glad I could help." "It felt like more than that," Sarah said softly. "It felt like the first time anyone has understood." They stood there for a moment, looking at each other in the golden afternoon light, and Sarah felt something shift between them. It was not love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that might grow into love given enough time and care. She saw the same awareness in his eyes, and it made her breath catch. "Can I see you again?" Ryder asked. "Not just if another storm comes through, but on purpose. Maybe I could take you to dinner tomorrow evening if you are willing." "I would like that," Sarah said, and she meant it more than she had meant anything in a long time. Ryder touched the brim of his hat and gave her a smile that transformed his whole face, making him look younger and almost boyish. "Tomorrow evening, then. I will come by at 6. She watched him walk back down the street toward where he had left his horse, and she felt lighter than she had in years. Maybe it was foolish to feel hopeful after just one encounter, but she could not help it. For the first time since her brother died, someone had held her through her fear and had not made her feel ashamed of it. That was worth hoping for. The next evening, Ryder arrived at exactly 6 o'clock, cleaned up and wearing what was clearly his best shirt. Sarah had changed 3 times before settling on a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and she saw appreciation in his gaze when she opened the door. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you," she replied, feeling her cheeks warm. "Where are we going?" "There is a restaurant at the hotel that serves decent food," he said, offering her his arm. "I thought we could eat there and then maybe take a walk if the weather holds." They walked to the hotel together, making small talk about the town and the weather, which had been clear and sunny all day. The restaurant was not fancy, but it was clean and the food was good, and more importantly, it gave them a chance to sit across from each other and really talk for the first time. "Tell me about your work," Sarah said after they had ordered. "What is it like working on a ranch?" Ryder leaned back in his chair, looking more relaxed than he had yesterday. "It is hard work, but good work. I am up before dawn most days, checking on the cattle, riding fence lines, helping with the horses. Mr. Patterson runs about 500 head of cattle and maybe 30 horses, and he has 4 of us working for him full-time. We sleep in the bunkhouse and eat in the main house, and the work is never really done." "Do you like it?" she asked. "I do," he said. "I like being outside, like working with my hands. I like that at the end of the day I can see what I have accomplished. When you mend a fence or break a horse or deliver a calf, you know you have done something real." Sarah nodded, understanding that. "I feel the same way about sewing. When I finish a dress or mend a torn shirt, I can hold it up and know that I made something better than it was." They talked through dinner about their lives, their hopes, their fears. Ryder told her about wanting to have his own ranch someday, a small place where he could raise horses and maybe a few cattle, somewhere he could build a life that was truly his. Sarah told him about her dreams of opening her own dress shop, somewhere she could design and create instead of just doing mending work for other people. "Why Red Bluff?" Ryder asked. "It seems like San Francisco would have more opportunities for a seamstress." "San Francisco was where my parents died," Sarah said quietly. "Everything there reminded me of them, of what I had lost. I needed to go somewhere different, somewhere I could breathe again. Red Bluff is not perfect, but it is mine in a way San Francisco never could be." Ryder reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm around hers. "I understand that. Sometimes you need a fresh start, a place where nobody knows your history or your pain." After dinner, they walked through the quiet streets of Red Bluff as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. They talked about everything and nothing, finding an easy rhythm between them that felt natural and right. When they reached the boarding house again, Ryder hesitated on the porch. "I would like to see you again," he said. "And again after that if you will let me." "I would like that too," Sarah said softly. He lifted her hand and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. "Good night, Sarah." "Good night, Ryder." She watched him walk away again, and this time when she went inside, she was smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. Over the next 3 weeks, Ryder came to town whenever he could spare the time, which was usually twice a week in the evenings. They would have dinner or take walks, or sometimes just sit on the porch of the boarding house and talk while the sun went down. Sarah found herself looking forward to his visits with an intensity that surprised her, and she could tell from the way his face lit up when he saw her that he felt the same way. They were careful with each other at first, both of them aware that what was growing between them was fragile and precious. But gradually, as the days turned into weeks, that carefulness began to give way to something deeper. Ryder started holding her hand when they walked, and Sarah would lean against him on the porch swing, her head on his shoulder. They were not rushing toward anything, but they were definitely moving in that direction together. Then, on a Thursday evening in early August, the sky began to darken while they were eating dinner at the hotel. Sarah noticed it first, the way the light changed, the way the air suddenly felt heavy and charged. Her appetite disappeared and her hands started to shake around her fork. "Sarah," Ryder said, noticing immediately. "What is wrong? Storm coming," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the window. He turned to look and saw the dark clouds rolling in from the west. Without hesitation, he stood up and threw some money on the table, then came around to help her up. "Come on. We will go back to the boarding house." They made it halfway there before the first rumble of thunder rolled across the sky. Sarah stopped walking, her whole body going rigid, and Ryder immediately pulled her into his arms. "I've got you," he said against her hair. "Just like last time. I am right here." The storm hit hard and fast, rain pouring down in torrents that soaked them both within seconds. Ryder guided her to the nearest shelter, which happened to be the covered entrance to the bank, and they huddled there while the storm unleashed its fury around them. Sarah was shaking so hard she could barely stand, and Ryder sat down on the ground and pulled her down into his lap, wrapping his arms around her and holding her tight against his chest. "Listen to me," he said, his voice steady and sure despite the chaos. "You are safe. I am here and you are safe. The storm cannot hurt you." Thunder cracked so loud it felt like the world was splitting apart, and Sarah buried her face against his neck and sobbed. Ryder held her tighter, one hand stroking her wet hair, the other pressed firmly against her back. "That is it," he murmured. "Let it out. I have got you. I am not going anywhere." He began to talk then, the way he had during that first storm, his voice a steady anchor in the tempest. He told her about the first time he had seen the ocean, how vast and powerful it had been. He told her about a sunset he had seen once from horseback, when the whole sky had turned gold and red, and it had felt like riding through fire. He told her about his sister's wedding and how happy she had looked, and how he had realized that day that he wanted that same kind of happiness for himself someday. "I think I could have that with you," he said softly, his lips against her temple. "If you wanted it too. I know we have not known each other long, but Sarah, I feel like I have been waiting for you my whole life. You make me want things I never thought I could have." Sarah lifted her head to look at him, tears streaming down her face mixing with the rain. "You make me brave," she whispered. "When I am with you, I feel like I could face anything." He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her then, soft and gentle and full of promise. Sarah kissed him back, her hands clutching at his wet shirt, and for just a moment the storm faded away and there was only the two of them, only this connection that felt bigger than fear, bigger than pain, bigger than anything she had ever known. The thunder boomed again and she flinched but did not pull away. Ryder deepened the kiss, and she felt his courage flowing into her like a transfusion. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the storm was already beginning to move on. "I am falling in love with you," Ryder said, his forehead pressed against hers. "I need you to know that." "I am falling in love with you too," Sarah admitted, the words feeling like both a confession and a liberation. They stayed there in the shelter of the bank entrance until the rain stopped, holding each other and stealing kisses between rumbles of thunder. And Sarah realized that for the first time in 15 years, a storm had ended and she did not feel broken by it. She felt stronger, braver, like she could face the next one and the one after that, as long as Ryder was there beside her. When the sky finally cleared, he walked her back to the boarding house, both of them soaked through but neither caring. At her door, he kissed her again, slower this time, deeper, a kiss that spoke of all the tomorrows they were beginning to hope for together. "I am going to talk to Mr. Patterson tomorrow," Ryder said when they finally pulled apart. "Ask him about building a cabin on the ranch property. Somewhere we could live if you would be willing to marry me." Sarah's breath caught. "Is that a proposal?" "Not yet," he said with a small smile. "I want to do it right when I have something to offer you besides a bunk in a ranch house. But I wanted you to know where my mind is, where my heart is. I want a future with you, Sarah. I want to build something with you." "I want that too," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "More than anything." Over the next month, Ryder worked like a man possessed. He talked to Mr. Patterson, who agreed to let him build a small cabin on the eastern edge of the ranch property, and to give him a small plot of land to go with it. Ryder worked his regular hours during the day and then spent his evenings and weekends building the cabin, often working by lamplight long after the sun had gone down. Sarah came out to the ranch whenever she could, usually on Sundays, and she would bring lunch and sit with him while he worked. Sometimes she would help, handing him tools or holding boards steady while he hammered, and sometimes she would just sit on a nearby rock and sew while she watched him. She loved seeing him like this, focused and determined, building their future with his own two hands. "It is not going to be fancy," he said one Sunday afternoon in September, wiping sweat from his brow. "But it will be solid. It will keep out the rain and the cold, and we can add on to it as we need to." "It is perfect," Sarah said, and she meant it. The cabin was small but well built, with a main room that would serve as kitchen and living space, a separate bedroom, and a loft above that could be used for storage or eventually for children. Ryder was building furniture too, a table and chairs, a bed frame, shelves for the walls. Every piece showed the care he was putting into making this place a home for them. In late September, another storm rolled through Red Bluff. This time, Sarah was at the ranch with Ryder, and when the thunder started, he immediately set down his hammer and came to her. "Come here," he said, pulling her into his arms. "I have got you." They went inside the partially finished cabin and sat on the floor with their backs against the wall, Ryder holding Sarah close while the storm raged outside. He talked her through it the way he always did, his voice steady and calm, his arms strong around her. "You are so brave," he murmured against her hair. "Do you know that? Every time you face a storm, you are doing something that terrifies you. That is the very definition of courage." "I do not feel brave," Sarah said, her voice muffled against his chest. "But you are," he insisted. "Bravery is not about not being afraid. It is about being afraid and doing it anyway. You do that every single time, Sarah, every single storm." When that storm passed, Sarah realized something had changed. She was still afraid of the thunder, still flinched at every crack and boom, but the fear was not as overwhelming as it had been. Having Ryder there, having his steady presence and his constant reassurance, was teaching her that fear did not have to control her. She could be afraid and still survive. She could be afraid and still be loved. In early October, Ryder finished the cabin. He had been working on it for 6 weeks, and the result was a small but sturdy home that looked out over the rolling hills of the Patterson Ranch. Sarah came out to see it the day he put the final touches on, and when she walked inside and saw the table he had built, the bed he had crafted, the shelves he had hung on the walls, she burst into tears. "What is wrong?" Ryder asked, immediately concerned. "Nothing is wrong," she said, laughing through her tears. "Everything is so right. You built this for us. You made us a home." He pulled her into his arms and held her close, his heart pounding against her ear. Does that mean you will marry me? I know I have not asked properly yet, but Sarah, I cannot wait another day. I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you be my wife? Yes, Sarah said without hesitation. Yes, I will marry you. Ryder let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around in the middle of their new home. When he set her down, he kissed her deeply, and Sarah felt like her heart might burst from happiness. They were married 3 weeks later in the little church on the corner of Main and Oak. It was a small ceremony. Just a few of Ryder's friends from the ranch and some of Sarah's acquaintances from town, with Mrs. Chen standing up as Sarah's witness. Sarah wore a dress she had made herself, pale yellow with lace at the collar and cuffs, and Ryder wore a new suit that he had bought special for the occasion. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Ryder kissed her like it was the first and last kiss all at once, and Sarah felt tears of joy streaming down her face. They walked out of the church together hand in hand, and even though the sky was cloudy and there was rain in the forecast, Sarah was not afraid. She had Ryder now, and that made all the difference. Their first night in the cabin was everything Sarah had hoped for and more. Ryder was gentle and patient, mindful of her nervousness, and by the time the sun rose the next morning, Sarah felt like she had been transformed. She was no longer just Sarah Matthews, the frightened seamstress. She was Sarah Quinn, wife of Ryder Quinn, and she was building a life that was entirely her own. The first few months of marriage were an adjustment for both of them. Sarah had to get used to living on a ranch instead of in town, to the sounds and smells and rhythms of ranch life. She continued her sewing work, with women from town bringing her their mending and their dress orders, and she found that she enjoyed the solitude of the cabin while Ryder was out working during the day. Ryder had to learn how to share his space and his life with another person after years of living alone in the bunkhouse. But they were both committed to making their marriage work, and they approached their life together with the same care and attention they had shown during their courtship. The first big storm after their wedding came in mid-November, a fierce autumn tempest that brought high winds and lashing rain along with the thunder. Sarah was alone in the cabin when it hit, with Ryder out checking on the cattle, and for a few terrifying minutes, she thought she would fall apart without him there to hold her. But then she remembered his words, remembered all the times he had told her she was brave and strong and courageous. She wrapped herself in the quilt from their bed, the one Mrs. Chen had made as a wedding present, and she sat at the table and forced herself to breathe slowly and evenly. Every time the thunder cracked, she flinched, but she did not fall apart. She sat there and rode out the storm, and when Ryder finally burst through the door, soaking wet and worried, he found her still sitting at the table, shaken but whole. "I was so worried," he said, pulling her into his arms. "I tried to get back as fast as I could." "I know," Sarah said, her voice trembling but steady, "but I was all right. I was scared, but I was all right." Ryder pulled back to look at her, his eyes shining with pride. "You did it. You got through it on your own." "I kept thinking about what you always tell me," she said. "About being brave, about courage, and I realized that even when you are not physically here, you are still with me. Your words, your love, they are always with me." He kissed her then, deep and passionate, and Sarah felt a surge of love so strong it almost overwhelmed her. This man had seen her at her most vulnerable and had not turned away. He had held her through her fears and had taught her that she was stronger than she thought. That was a gift beyond price. As autumn turned to winter, Sarah and Ryder settled into their life together. They developed routines and rhythms, learning each other's habits and quirks. Ryder would rise before dawn to start his work, and Sarah would get up with him to make his breakfast and pack his lunch. She would spend her days sewing and keeping the cabin, and he would come home in the evenings tired and dirty and always happy to see her. They would eat dinner together at the table he had built, talking about their days, making plans for the future. After dinner, Ryder would often read aloud while Sarah sewed, or they would play cards, or sometimes they would just sit together in front of the fire, content in each other's company. Winter brought more storms, and each one was a test of Sarah's courage. But with each storm she weathered, whether Ryder was there or not, she felt herself growing stronger. The fear never went away completely, but it became more manageable, less all-consuming. She learned to breathe through it, to remind herself that storms always ended, that she had survived every one so far and would survive the next. In February, Sarah realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had wanted to be sure before she told Ryder. When she finally shared the news with him one evening after dinner, she watched his face go through a series of emotions, from surprise to joy to something that looked almost like fear. "A baby," he said, his voice hushed. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Sarah asked, suddenly nervous. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Ryder said, pulling her into his arms. "I am terrified and thrilled and so grateful I can barely think straight. A baby, Sarah. We are going to be parents." They held each other for a long time, both of them letting the reality of it sink in. Their family was growing, their life was expanding, and it felt like the most natural and wonderful thing in the world. The pregnancy was not easy. Sarah suffered from terrible morning sickness for the first 3 months, and Ryder would hold her hair back while she was ill and bring her dry toast and weak tea to settle her stomach. As she grew bigger, she found it harder to do her sewing work, her back aching and her fingers swelling. But through it all, Ryder was there, patient and supportive and endlessly loving. Spring brought the promise of new life in more ways than one. The ranch began to come alive with new calves and foals, and Sarah's belly grew round with their child. They spent long evenings sitting on the porch of the cabin, watching the sunset and talking about what kind of parents they wanted to be. "I want our children to know they are loved," Sarah said one evening, her hand resting on her belly. "Always loved, no matter what." "They will know," Ryder promised, covering her hand with his, "because we will show them every single day." In late May, another storm rolled through, bigger than any they had seen that spring. Sarah was 8 months pregnant and uncomfortable, and when the thunder started, Ryder immediately dropped what he was doing and came to sit beside her. "Come here," he said, pulling her into his arms as much as her belly would allow. "I have got you both." The storm was fierce, with lightning that lit up the whole sky and thunder that shook the cabin walls. Sarah clung to Ryder, her fear mingling with the discomfort of the baby pressing on her ribs and bladder. But even through her fear, she was aware of how far she had come. A year ago, a storm like this would have reduced her to a sobbing mess. Now, even though she was still afraid, she could function through it. She could breathe through it. She could survive it. "You are so strong," Ryder murmured against her hair. "Look at you carrying our child, facing your fear. You are the bravest person I know." "I learned it from you," Sarah said. "You taught me that I could be brave." "No," Ryder said firmly. "The bravery was always in you, I just helped you see it." When the storm finally passed, they sat together in the quiet aftermath, listening to the rain drip from the eaves. Sarah felt the baby move inside her, a strong kick against her ribs, and she took Ryder's hand and placed it on her belly so he could feel it too. "Our son or daughter," she said softly. "Growing up in this cabin you built, learning to be brave from both of us." "The luckiest child in the world," Ryder said, his voice thick with emotion. Their son was born on a clear, sunny day in mid-June, after a labor that lasted nearly 20 hours. Ryder stayed with Sarah the whole time, holding her hand, wiping her brow, whispering encouragement. When the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Ryder cut the cord with shaking hands and then burst into tears. "We have a son," he said, his voice breaking. "Sarah, we have a son." They named him Robert Matthew Quinn, after Sarah's brother, and his middle name honoring her maiden name. He was a healthy baby with a strong set of lungs and his father's blue-gray eyes. Sarah fell in love with him instantly and completely, and watching Ryder hold their tiny son with such gentleness and awe made her fall even more deeply in love with her husband. The first few weeks with the baby were exhausting and overwhelming and wonderful all at once. Sarah was healing from the birth, and Robert needed to be fed every few hours, and neither of them was getting much sleep. But they worked together, taking turns walking the floor with the baby when he fussed, supporting each other through the difficult moments, celebrating the small victories like when Robert finally latched properly or slept for more than 3 hours at a stretch. Ryder was an unexpectedly natural father. He would hold Robert for hours, just staring down at him with an expression of pure wonder. He would sing to him in a low, rumbling voice old songs from his childhood that Sarah had never heard. He changed diapers without complaint and learned to swaddle the baby as expertly as any nursemaid. "I never knew I could love someone this much," Ryder said one night as he rocked Robert to sleep. "Except for you. I love him as much as I love you, just in a different way." "I know," Sarah said softly. "I feel the same way." Their first storm with the baby came when Robert was 6 weeks old. Sarah had been dreading it, worried about how she would handle her fear while also needing to stay calm for their son. When the first rumble of thunder rolled across the sky, she felt the familiar panic start to rise in her chest, but then Robert began to fuss and her maternal instincts kicked in. Ryder was there immediately, taking Robert from her arms. "I have got him," he said. "You sit down." But Sarah shook her head. "No, give him to me. I need to do this." Ryder looked at her for a long moment, then carefully placed Robert back in her arms. He sat down beside her and put his arm around them both, creating a circle of protection and love. The storm grew louder, and Sarah felt her heart racing, but she forced herself to focus on her son. She hummed to him, a lullaby her mother used to sing, and she rocked him gently. Robert began to settle, his tiny fist closing around her finger, and Sarah felt something inside her shift and change. "I can do this," she whispered. "I can be brave for him." "You can be brave for yourself too," Ryder said softly. "You do not have to be strong just for him or for me. You can be strong for you." The thunder cracked loud enough to rattle the windows, and Sarah flinched but did not fall apart. She kept humming, kept rocking, kept holding her son, and gradually the fear began to recede. By the time the storm passed, Robert was asleep in her arms, completely peaceful, and Sarah felt like she had just won a great victory. "You did it," Ryder said, pride shining in his eyes. "You got through it while taking care of him. Sarah, you are amazing." She leaned against him, exhausted but triumphant. "We did it. Together like always." As Robert grew from an infant into a toddler, life on the ranch continued to evolve and change. Ryder was promoted to foreman of the Patterson Ranch, a position that came with more responsibility but also more pay. They were able to add on to the cabin, building a second bedroom and expanding the kitchen. Sarah's sewing business grew as well, and she found herself making not just mending simple repairs, but designing and creating custom dresses for the women of Red Bluff and the surrounding ranches. Robert was a happy, energetic child who loved following his father around the ranch. By the time he was 3, he was already learning to ride a gentle old mare named Daisy, and he would chatter endlessly about the cows and the horses and everything he saw. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's eyes, and he had inherited both of their determination and stubbornness. Through it all, the storms kept coming, as storms always do. But each time, Sarah faced them with a little more courage, a little more strength. Ryder was always there when he could be, holding her, talking to her, reminding her of her own bravery. And when he could not be there, she would think of him, of his words, of his love, and she would find the strength to weather the storm on her own. One evening in late summer, when Robert was 4 years old, a massive thunderstorm rolled across the valley. It was the kind of storm that made even the bravest souls nervous, with lightning that seemed to split the sky in half and thunder that sounded like cannon fire. Ryder had been caught out checking fence lines when it hit, and Sarah was alone in the cabin with Robert. Robert was frightened by the storm, crying and clinging to his mother, and Sarah knew she had to be strong for him. She gathered him into her lap and wrapped them both in a quilt, then began to do what Ryder had always done for her. She started to talk. "Once upon a time," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "there was a brave cowboy who was not afraid of anything. Not wild horses, not angry bulls, not even thunderstorms." Robert sniffled and looked up at her. "Like Papa, just like Papa," Sarah agreed. And one day, this brave cowboy met a woman who was afraid of thunderstorms. But he did not think she was silly or weak. He thought she was brave for facing something that scared her so much. "What did he do?" Robert asked, his fear momentarily forgotten. "He held her during every storm," Sarah said, her voice soft and full of love. "And he talked to her and told her stories and reminded her that she was strong and brave. And slowly, over time, she began to believe him. She began to see herself the way he saw her." The thunder boomed again, and both Sarah and Robert flinched, but she kept talking. "And then they had a little boy," she continued. "The bravest, most wonderful little boy in the whole world. And when storms came, they would all hold each other and remember that they were a family, and that together they could face anything." "Are we brave, Mama?" Robert asked, his little voice trembling. "Yes, we are," Sarah said firmly. "We are very, very brave." They sat together through the storm, Sarah holding her son and telling him stories, and she realized that she was not just comforting him. She was comforting herself too. The fear was still there. It probably always would be, but it no longer controlled her. She had learned to live with it, to function despite it, to be brave in spite of it. When Ryder finally made it home, soaked to the skin and worried, he found them both asleep on the floor wrapped in the quilt. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking at them, his heart so full of love it ached. Sarah woke to find him watching them. "We were fine," she said softly. "We were brave." "I never doubted it," Ryder said, kneeling down beside them. "Not for a second." The years continued to pass, marked by seasons and storms and the steady growth of their family. When Robert was 5, Sarah gave birth to twin girls, Emma and Grace, who had their father's eyes and their mother's dark hair. The cabin was expanded again to accommodate the growing family, and their life became a beautiful chaos of children and animals and work and love. Ryder taught Robert everything he knew about ranching and horses, and Sarah taught the twins to sew and cook and run a household. But both parents made sure all their children knew the most important lesson of all, that being afraid was not shameful, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face it anyway. Robert grew into a steady, reliable boy who loved the ranch and everything about it. Emma was bold and adventurous, always climbing trees and chasing after her brother. Grace was quieter and more thoughtful, preferring books and needlework to outdoor adventures. They were all so different, but they all carried the love and strength of their parents. Through all the years, through all the storms, Ryder kept his promise. Whenever thunder rolled across the sky, he was there for Sarah, holding her, talking to her, whispering courage. And Sarah, who had once been so broken by her fear, had learned to stand tall in the face of it. She would never completely lose her fear of storms, but she had learned that fear did not have to define her. One evening when Robert was 12 and the twins were 7, a particularly fierce storm hit the ranch. The whole family gathered in the main room of the cabin, Ryder and Sarah on the sofa with the children clustered around them. The thunder was so loud it made the walls shake, and the lightning lit up the room bright as day. Robert noticed his mother tense up and reached over to take her hand. "It is all right, Mama," he said quietly. "Papa has got you and we have got you too." Sarah looked around at her family, at her strong, brave husband and her beautiful children, and she felt tears prick her eyes. "I know," she said. "I have always known." Emma scooted closer, wrapping her small arms around Sarah's waist. "Tell us a story, Mama, like you always do." So Sarah began to talk, her voice steady and sure, telling them about the day she met their father, about how he had held her through her first storm and had taught her what it meant to be brave. She told them about building the cabin, about their wedding, about the day each of them was born. She told them about all the storms they had weathered together, literal and metaphorical, and how love had carried them through all of it. The children listened, rapt, and Ryder held her close, his eyes shining with unshed tears. This was what they had built together, this family, this life, this love that was stronger than any storm. When the thunder finally began to fade, Grace looked up at her parents. "I want to be brave like you and Papa," she said softly. "You already are," Sarah said, kissing the top of her head. "You all are. You come from bravery, from love, from strength. It is in your bones." As the storm moved on and the stars began to peek through the breaking clouds, the Quinn family stayed huddled together on the sofa, none of them quite ready to break the spell of closeness and comfort. Ryder looked at Sarah over the heads of their children, and the look they shared spoke of all the years behind them and all the years still to come. The years continued to unfold with a gentle persistence. Robert grew into a young man of 18, tall and strong like his father, with a deep love for the land and the animals. He had taken over many of the daily responsibilities of the ranch, working alongside Ryder with an easy competence that made both his parents proud. He had started courting a girl from town, a sweet-natured young woman named Catherine who worked at the general store, and Sarah could see in his eyes the same kind of love she had felt for Ryder all those years ago. The twins were 13 now, no longer little girls but young women beginning to find their own paths. Emma had become an accomplished horsewoman, often joining her father and brother on the range, her hair braided back and her face tanned from the sun. Grace had taken after her mother, with nimble fingers that could create beautiful embroidery and a keen eye for design. She had already started helping Sarah with the more complicated sewing projects, and they would sit together in the afternoons, their needles flashing in the sunlight that streamed through the windows. The ranch had prospered under Ryder's management, and Mr. Patterson, now an old man, had sold them a larger parcel of land. They ran their own small herd of cattle now, along with a breeding program for horses that was becoming known throughout Northern California. The cabin had been expanded and improved so many times, it was barely recognizable from the simple structure Ryder had built more than 15 years before. It was a real home now, with multiple bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, a front porch that wrapped around 2 sides, and a barn that housed their growing number of animals. Sarah was 40 years old now, and the years had been kind to her. There were lines around her eyes and silver threads in her dark hair, but Ryder thought she was more beautiful than ever. She moved with a confidence she had never had as a young woman, secure in herself and in the life they had built together. Ryder himself was 43, his hair more gray than brown now, his body bearing the aches and scars of a lifetime of hard work. But he was happy, deeply and completely happy, in a way he had never imagined possible when he was a young cowboy drifting west with nothing but a horse and a dream. One evening in July, 20 years to the month after that first storm, when he had held Sarah on the porch of the general store, another massive thunderstorm rolled across the valley. The whole family was home, Robert and the twins helping Sarah prepare dinner while Ryder finished up some paperwork at the table. When the first rumble of thunder sounded, everyone paused and looked at Sarah. She felt the familiar flutter of fear in her chest, the same instinctive panic that had never completely gone away. But then Ryder was there, his hand warm on her shoulder, and she took a deep breath and steadied herself. "I am all right," she said, and she meant it. The storm grew in intensity, rain hammering on the roof, wind howling around the corners of the house. Lightning flashed bright enough to see even with the lamps lit, and the thunder that followed was deafening. Sarah felt herself start to shake, and without a word, Ryder pulled her into his arms. 20 years, he murmured against her hair. 20 years of storms, and I have held you through every single one. Not every one, Sarah said. Sometimes I have had to be brave on my own. And you were, Ryder said. Every single time. Robert came over and put his hand on his mother's back, a gesture of support and love. Emma and Grace crowded close too, and suddenly, Sarah was surrounded by her family, all of them touching her, all of them offering their strength and comfort. "We are all here, Mama," Emma said. "You are not alone." Sarah looked around at the faces of the people she loved most in the world, and she felt something break open inside her, something that had been held tight for so very long. Tears began to stream down her face, but they were not tears of fear. They were tears of gratitude, of joy, of overwhelming love. "I am so blessed," she whispered. "So very blessed." They stood there together as the storm raged outside, a tight circle of love and support, and Sarah realized that this was what courage looked like. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of love strong enough to face that fear head-on. Ryder had taught her that 20 years ago, and their children had learned it from both of them, and now they were teaching it back to her. When the storm finally passed, they ate dinner together at the big table, talking and laughing and sharing stories from their day. After the dishes were washed and put away, Robert headed out to check on the horses one last time, and the twins went upstairs to their room. Sarah and Ryder were left alone in the kitchen, standing side by side at the sink and looking out the window at the clearing sky. "You remember that first storm?" Sarah asked softly. "When you held me on the porch of the general store?" "I remember everything about that day," Ryder said. "I remember thinking you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, even with tears streaming down your face. I remember holding you and feeling like I had found something I did not even know I was looking for." "You saved me that day," Sarah said. "No," Ryder corrected gently. "I helped you." "But you saved yourself, Sarah. You chose to be brave. You chose to face your fear. You chose to live your life instead of letting that fear control you. All I did was stand beside you while you did the hard work." Sarah turned to look at him, this man who had been her rock for 20 years, who had held her through countless storms and had never once made her feel weak or foolish. "I love you," she said simply. "More now than ever." "I love you too," Ryder said, pulling her into his arms. "Always have, always will." They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other while the last of the storm clouds drifted away and the stars began to emerge. Through the window, they could see Robert in the barn, checking on the horses the way his father had taught him. Upstairs, they could hear the soft murmur of the twins' voices as they prepared for bed. This was the life they had built, storm by storm, day by day, year by year. It was not perfect, nothing ever was, but it was theirs. It was real and solid and full of love, and that was more than Sarah had ever dreamed possible when she was a frightened young woman dropping apples in the street. The years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of seasons and storms. Robert married his Catherine in a beautiful ceremony at the church in Red Bluff, and a year later they had a son of their own, making Sarah and Ryder grandparents for the first time. They built a small house on the northern edge of the ranch property, close enough to help with the work but far enough to have their own space. Emma, to everyone's surprise except perhaps her mother's, announced at 16 that she wanted to learn to break and train horses professionally. Ryder taught her everything he knew, and by the time she was 20, she had a reputation throughout the valley as one of the best horse trainers around. She eventually married a fellow horse trainer from a neighboring ranch, and together they built a business that thrived. Grace took over Sarah's sewing business when she turned 18, expanding it into a full dressmaking shop in Red Bluff. She had a gift for design that went beyond anything Sarah had possessed, and women came from as far away as Sacramento to commission dresses from her. She married a banker from town, a quiet, studious man who adored her completely. As grandchildren arrived, the ranch became even more lively. Robert and Catherine had 3 children. Emma and her husband had 2, and Grace and her husband had 4. The cabin and the surrounding land were always full of the sound of children laughing and playing, and Sarah thought it was the most beautiful sound in the world. Ryder was 60 now, his hair completely gray, his body showing the wear of decades of hard physical labor. He had handed over most of the daily running of the ranch to Robert and Emma, though he still went out every day to check on things and offer advice. He moved a little slower now, and sometimes his joints ached in the morning, but his eyes were still sharp and his mind was still keen. Sarah was 57, her hair mostly silver now, her hands showing the signs of a lifetime of needlework. But she was still strong, still capable, still the center of their large and loving family. She had become the matriarch, the one everyone came to for advice and comfort and wisdom. And through all the years, through all the changes, one thing remained constant. Whenever a storm rolled through, Ryder would find Sarah and hold her. Sometimes it was just the 2 of them in their bedroom, and sometimes it was surrounded by children and grandchildren, but he always held her. He always whispered courage. He always reminded her that she was brave. One afternoon in late September, when the leaves were just beginning to turn, and there was a hint of autumn in the air, Sarah and Ryder sat together on the porch of their cabin. They were in their 70s now, both of them slowing down considerably, though neither willing to admit it. Their children and grandchildren visited often, and the ranch continued to thrive under Robert's careful management. But these quiet moments alone together had become increasingly precious. "Do you remember when we first met?" Sarah asked, holding Ryder's weathered hand in her own. "Every detail," Ryder said with a soft smile. "You were the most terrified and the most beautiful thing I had ever seen." "And you were the bravest," Sarah said, "the kindest, the most patient." "We have had a good life," Ryder said, looking out over the land they had worked and loved for so many decades. "The best life," Sarah agreed. As if summoned by their reminiscing, dark clouds began to gather on the horizon. Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the old fear that had never completely left her, but it was more of an echo now than a roar. 55 years of storms, 55 years of facing her fear, had softened its edges. "Storm coming," Ryder observed, his arm automatically going around her shoulders. "I know," Sarah said, leaning into him. I am not as afraid as I used to be." "You were never as weak as you thought you were," Ryder said. "From that very first day you had more courage than you knew." The storm rolled in slowly, giving them time to move inside before the rain started. They settled onto the sofa in the main room, the same sofa where they had held their children through countless storms, where they had shared so many quiet evenings together. The thunder began, distant at first and then growing louder. Sarah felt herself tense and Ryder's arms tightened around her. "I have got you," he said, the same words he had said 1,000 times before. "I will always have you." "I know," Sarah whispered. "I have always known." The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin it was warm and dry and safe. Sarah closed her eyes and listened to Ryder's heartbeat, steady and strong beneath her ear, and she thought about all the storms they had weathered together. All the years, all the challenges, all the joys and sorrows and everything in between. "Thank you," she said softly, "for holding me through every storm, for teaching me to be brave, for loving me exactly as I am." "Thank you for letting me," Ryder replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for trusting me, for building this life with me, for giving me everything I never knew I needed." They sat together as the storm moved through, neither speaking, just holding each other the way they had done for more than 50 years. And when the thunder finally faded and the rain slowed to a gentle patter, they remained where they were, neither wanting to break the spell of closeness and peace. That evening, surrounded by 3 generations of the family they had created, Sarah looked around the crowded room and felt her heart swell with gratitude. This was what she and Ryder had built together, not just a ranch or a home, but a legacy of love and courage that would continue long after they were gone. Robert stood at the head of the table, his own grandchildren clustered around him, and raised his glass. "To my parents," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "who taught us all what it means to be brave, to be loving, to face our fears with courage and grace. Everything good in my life comes from you both." "To Mama and Papa," Emma added, her eyes shining with tears. "To Mama and Papa," Grace echoed, and soon the whole room was repeating it, a chorus of love and gratitude. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but they were happy tears. Ryder squeezed her hand, his own eyes wet, and they looked at each other with a love that had only deepened and strengthened over more than 5 decades together. That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Sarah and Ryder lay in bed together, listening to the last patters of rain on the roof. "I am so glad you were there that day," Sarah said into the darkness. "I am so glad you saw me, that you helped me, that you loved me." "I am glad too," Ryder said, pulling her close. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Sarah Quinn, the very best thing." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, the way they had done for thousands of nights before, secure in the knowledge that whatever storms might come, they would face them together. The years that followed were gentle ones. Ryder and Sarah both slowed down considerably, spending most of their time on the porch of the cabin, watching their grandchildren and great-grandchildren play in the yard. The ranch continued to prosper under Robert's management, and all of their children were happy and settled in their own lives. Sarah's fear of storms never completely disappeared, but it had been transformed by 50 years of Ryder holding her, whispering courage, reminding her of her strength. She could now sit through most storms with only minor anxiety, and the worst ones were manageable as long as Ryder was there beside her. On a warm afternoon in May, when Sarah was 78 and Ryder was 81, they sat together on the porch swing, watching a group of their great-grandchildren chase each other around the yard. The sky was clear and blue, without a cloud in sight, and the air smelled of grass and wildflowers. "We did all right, did we not?" Ryder said, his voice a little raspy with age but still strong. "We did better than all right," Sarah said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We did wonderfully." "I have loved you for more than 50 years," Ryder said. "And I will love you for whatever time we have left, and then I will love you beyond that, in whatever comes next." "I will love you too," Sarah promised, "always and forever." They sat together in the sunshine, holding hands, watching their legacy play out before them in the forms of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. This was what they had built, storm by storm, day by day, year by year. A life full of love and courage and family. A life that had started with a frightened woman and a kind cowboy and had grown into something beautiful and enduring. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace. She had faced her fears, had built a life beyond anything she had dreamed possible, and she had done it all with Ryder by her side. That was the greatest gift she had ever received, and the greatest gift she could ever give, this love that had sustained them through every storm, this courage they had taught each other, this life they had created together. The evening stars began to emerge one by one, and Sarah and Ryder remained on the porch swing, watching them appear. There would be more storms, there always were, but Sarah knew she could face them. She had learned that fear did not have to control her, that love was stronger than fear, and that courage was not the absence of terror but the willingness to keep going despite it. Ryder had taught her all of that, had held her through hundreds of storms and had never once made her feel less than brave. And in return, she had given him her whole heart, her trust, her life. Together they had built something that would last long after they were gone, a legacy of love that would be passed down through generations. As full darkness fell and the great-grandchildren were called inside by their parents, Sarah and Ryder finally went into the cabin. They prepared for bed with the easy familiarity of a couple who had shared their lives for more than half a century, and when they finally lay down together, they reached for each other the way they always did. "Good night, my love," Ryder whispered. "Good night," Sarah replied. They fell asleep holding hands, their hearts beating in rhythm, their love as strong and steady as it had been 55 years before when a frightened woman had dropped her apples in the street and a kind cowboy had stopped to help. It was a love that had weathered every storm, a courage that had been whispered and shared and grown, and it was, Sarah thought as she drifted off to sleep, the most beautiful story she had ever been part of. Years later, when both Sarah and Ryder had passed on peacefully in their sleep within months of each other, their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered to remember them. They told stories of Ryder's patience and Sarah's bravery, of the love that had sustained them through decades of marriage, of the way Ryder had always held Sarah during storms and whispered courage, until she believed in herself. The ranch continued under Robert's children's management, and the cabin remained in the family, a testament to the life that Sarah and Ryder had built together. And whenever storms rolled through the valley, the family would gather together, holding each other the way Ryder had held Sarah, whispering courage the way he had taught them all to do. Because that was the legacy Sarah and Ryder had left behind. Not just land or property or wealth, but the knowledge that love could conquer fear, that courage could be learned, and that holding each other through the storms was the most important thing any of us could ever do. It was a legacy that would continue for generations, passed down from parent to child, a story of love and bravery that began with a crack of thunder and a cowboy who stopped to help, and that would echo through time for as long as their descendants remembered their names.